This video is designed to give a brief overview of the history of Australia. We will focus on its early colonisation in the late 1700s and the way in which those early colonies evolved to eventually look like the Australia we know today. Australia's history, of course, begins way before the first fleet's arrival in 1788. Indigenous Australians, also known as Aboriginal people, have been in these lands for at least the past 40,000 years. That's compared to the 228 years Europeans have lived here. It's important that we remember this at all times when we're considering Australian history and the way in which their culture and way of life has been permanently disrupted by European settlement. Often we think of Captain James Cook as the first European to discover Australia, but this actually isn't true. More than 100 years before Cook arrived, there were a number of Dutch expeditions that landed in Western Australia, and before that it's believed that the Portuguese had arrived on the same coastline. This was at a time when the whole world had not been mapped out yet. There were still lots of undiscovered and unclaimed land to be found. So European countries like England, Holland, Spain, France and Portugal put a lot of time and money into finding new places and claiming them. So if the Dutch and Portuguese got here first, why didn't they colonise Australia? Well, those ships happened to land in the part of Western Australia where there's pretty much nothing. It's just desert right up until the ocean, so when the explorers arrived, they took a quick look around, decided it wasn't much good, and kept going. It would have cost a lot of money and resources to colonise this land so far away from Europe, and it wouldn't have been worth it to set up a place where they couldn't grow crops. This changed in 1770 when Captain James Cook and the crew on his ship, the Endeavour, came from the other direction and would end up finding the east coast of Australia. Cook landed in Botany Bay, near where Sydney is now. The land there was full of life, and a scientist on board the ship, whose name was Joseph Banks, noted that there was a lot of possibility in this new place. Still, given how far away England is from Australia, colonisation would have been very difficult. Remember, there were no planes or trucks back then. If you wanted to establish a new settlement, you would have to do it with ships, horses, and manual labour. So when Captain Cook and Banks returned to England, their discovery was noted and celebrated, but no immediate plans to colonise the new territory were made. At this time, Britain already had colonies set up over in America, but that wouldn't last very long. In 1775, Britain had to go over to fight to keep control of its colonies. The American people were fed up with being controlled by a king that was so far away, and they wanted the right to govern themselves. Britain sent its army to fight the Americans and strengthen their control, but by 1783 they had lost the war and had to retreat. That left America as an independent nation. Losing America meant that England now had a big problem of not having enough space. As you can see, it's a small country, and their population was growing. There wasn't enough food to sustain the people, and disease was spreading through the country. That meant that crime was very high, as many poor people turned to stealing to feed themselves and their families. High crime rates left Britain with lots of convicts and nowhere to put them. Prior to the War of Independence, many convicts had been sent to America, but this wasn't an option anymore. So Britain made the decision to set up in Australia instead. The plan was to use convict labour to build a new society on the other side of the world. This would give England new territory and also solve its convict problem. The first fleet of British ships arrived in Australia in Botany Bay, the exact place that Captain Cook had found 18 years prior. The fleet was made up of 11 ships containing over 1,000 people. 778 of those people were convicts. When they arrived, those in charge were a bit shocked because they found that the place, Botany Bay, wasn't quite as nice as the reports from 18 years ago had made it out to be. After a few days, they decided to move the fleet north just a little bit to Port Jackson, the entranceway to what we now know as Sydney Harbour. This spot was much nicer, so the first settlement was established. It has remained there ever since, although it looks very different now. We now call it Sydney. The colony was under the rule of just one man, Governor Arthur Phillip. The governor was given complete power over the colonies by the British government back home, so he was essentially a dictator. Phillip was kept very busy in the early days, organising scouting missions to find the best places to plant crops and expand the settlement. Remember that at this time, the settlers had absolutely no idea what was here. They only had recorded what they'd been able to see from the boat trip in. To the west of the settlement, the Blue Mountains were in the way. You couldn't see past them and you couldn't get past them. This stopped the settlers from having any idea what inland Australia, this part here, what that was really like. There were no roads and no paths. Every step they took in any direction was brand new. Of course, for the Aboriginal people, there was nothing new about the land. Remember that they had been here for thousands and thousands of years. Governor Phillip wanted to establish good relationships with the Aboriginal people, but the settlers failed badly at this. To the Aboriginal people, these people were invaders. They had come and set up in their home without asking permission. They were understandably very upset, and to make matters worse, the colonial settlers had no real strategy to make peace with the Aboriginal people or learn their language. There was much conflict, and many Aboriginal people were harmed or killed. While Aboriginal people now have a strong place in Australian society, much of their 40,000-year-old culture and way of life remains damaged from that point less than 250 years ago. Over the next few years, more fleets of convicts and supervisors arrived. As the population of Australia grew, many problems appeared. Many of the convict workers turned out to be quite bad at farming and construction, which meant that the progress was slower than expected. And this slow progress meant that there was hardly enough food for everyone. So times were very tough during this period. People were generally unhappy and sick. Eventually, though, the colonies became more self-sufficient and began to spread out up and down the east coast of Australia. A colony in Tasmania was also established, which was then called Van Diemen's Land. An explorer called Matthew Flinders became the first to sail all the way around Australia, and that was actually what proved that it is an island, because before that people weren't entirely sure. Now, although the British colonies knew about the western side of Australia, they left it alone for quite a while because they were aware of the records that those Dutch sailors had been there first, and they didn't want to start a war. They did, however, begin to colonise more inland and set up colonies in what we now know as South Australia, Victoria, and Queensland. It wasn't until 1829 that Western Australia was officially claimed by Britain, once it became clear that the Dutch didn't really care about the land and they had no intention of colonising it themselves. It was called Swan River Colony at first, but they changed the name later to Western Australia. It's also worth noting here that at this time everything else was still called New South Wales except for Van Diemen's Land. It didn't get split off into different states until a bit later. Now, by the halfway point of the 1800s, about 1851 thereabouts, the colonies began to establish systems for self-governance. Before this point, the governors, as appointed by the King of England, had the right to make up whichever laws they wanted. And now, at this point, much of the population was made up of convicts who had earned their freedom. And so these people who felt that they were free citizens were unhappy that they didn't have the right to vote. Maybe because they remembered what had gone wrong in America, Britain allowed the colonies to have their own governments, which were elected by some people. The people who did get to vote were just the men who owned land, so still not everyone got a vote. The king and the governor would still be in charge, but all the small-scale day-to-day matters could be decided by the local representatives, and this made the people a lot happier because they felt that they had a voice in how their land was being run. This is also obviously the first time that democracy took place in Australia, and we still run under a democratic system to this day. For the next 50 years or so, the colonies, which now start to look like the states we know, continued to develop under their own governments. There was a new push though. It began in the late 1880s, and it was for the colonies to federalise, which means to become one nation. Before this, each colony was separate, but it was thought that it would be easier if the land could just be one single country, could just be Australia. It took a lot of negotiating between the governments of each colony, but eventually, in 1901, all the states had voted to join the Commonwealth of Australia. From this point on, Australia began to function the same way we know it does now. A lot has changed in the past 115 years. For example, our capital, Canberra, was not built until 1913, so for the first 12 years or so, Australia's capital was Melbourne. But that point in 1901 marked the end of Australia as a group of colonies and the start of Australia as an independent nation. And that brings us to an end for today. We've taken ourselves all the way up to the end of colonial Australia and the start of modern Australia in 1901. Thank you very much for watching.